And tonight's talk is possible due to the funding through the Grays Harbor County Marine Resource Committee. And I think that's all I have to say. Does anybody have any questions before we get started? I think we're good to go. Without further ado, go ahead, Troy. I'm excited to see and hear your talk.
Thank you. It's nice to see everyone tonight, and I hope that I can impart some information about our program just to help educate the population and maybe dispel some misnomers about the program as well. So if you have any questions, please just ask your questions. I don't mind interruptions during my presentation because you may forget your question when I get to the end. So I really want to answer all of your questions as best as I can. So I'm the program manager for the Derelict Vessel Removal Program at the Department of Natural Resources. I've been in the program, in the Derelict Vessel Removal Program, for almost 6 years now. I've been the program manager for the last 4. So just a little bit of history about the program. I'm sorry about that. So a little history about the program. It started in 2002, and that was in direct relation to some large vessels that were being removed out of the Columbia River. One of them was the Davy Crockett. It cost the U.S. Coast Guard about $24 million to remove that one. And it identified a lot of shortcomings in the way the state could handle these derelict and abandoned vessels. So they started legislation in 2002 and finally passed a law in 2003 to create the program. It's been in constant change since then because we're always trying to improve the program as we go along. So what the law did is it gave us the option to remove vessels. It gave us the ability to remove these vessels off of state-owned aquatic lands. It also gives authorized public entities the ability to use the program in their jurisdictions. So you're talking about cities, counties, ports, and parks. So it's not just DNR that's removing vessels. We also assist other agencies in the removal of these vessels as well. So our funding comes directly from a lot of the water users. So anyone who registers a vessel in this state in recreational is $3 per registration per year. For commercial, it's $1 per foot per year for the registration. And those fees are deposited into an account that is run by the Department of Licensing, who manages it for us. And every biennium, the legislature appropriates funds from that account to us so that we can spend it on the program. And that's usually around $2 million, with about $500,000 included in the $2 million that comes from the Department of Natural Resources. Because if we remove a vessel, we can only pull 90% of the funds from that account. We have to pay for the other 10% out of our own pocket. And the same is with all the other authorized public entities. So that's why they pitch in a little bit more. We usually run through our funding before we run out of vessels. I mean, that's just a matter of fact with this program. I ran a report this afternoon, and we have over 301 vessels on our vessel of concern list. That means we know of 301 vessels out there that meet the definition of abandoned or derelict. There may be more, we just don't know about them yet.
So I have a question.
Sure, Jim.
What about civil liability of the owners? Don't we know who these vessels are owned by?
Yeah, that's a great question. And most of the time we can find an owner. However, a lot of them don't have assets at all. A lot of them don't have anything that we can retrieve or recover these costs from at all. So all we can really do is write them a ticket and send them on their way. And usually what happens is we'll send them a letter saying, hey, you owe us this money. They ignore it. We send them to collections. That's unfortunate, but It's a real fact of life. We have gone after people who owe us millions of dollars and have had assets. So we've put liens on properties. We've taken them to court and got judgments against them. So when we realize that someone does have assets, we'll go after those as well. That's a mandate that we have to do. We have to try and cost recovery from these owners. There's a lot of people out there that'll obscure the numbers on their vessels so that makes it harder for us to find these owners. In addition to that, they don't always register the vessels, and after 6 years, the DOL deletes those records from their system. So it makes it hard for us to find owner information if it's older than 6 years old.
I mean, can't we stop them from deleting?
So I've asked that question, and they said no, because it's ingrained in their system, and it costs money to retain that information.
It
And they're
costs
not going to do
almost
it.
nothing.
Yeah, I know.
That's bullshit. Yeah.
It is, but that was their answer to me. And it's unfortunate because it's just a digital age, right? It's a few bits of information that they can retain for a long time. I would like to see them retain that information until the vessel is verified destroyed or registered in another state. But
It's that's the Department of Licensing,
correct.
and they keep it how long? 5 years?
6
6?
from the last activity on the account. So there's a bunch of different reasons why these vessels go abandoned and derelict. Confusion in ownership is one of them. When they sell these vessels on a napkin, they really can't do anything with those vessels afterwards because they can't prove ownership if they don't register it through the Department of Licensing. Others are neglected, forgotten about. People move out of the state and leave their boats behind. There's a multitude of reasons for people abandoning and derelicting their vessels. And some of them just happen to pass away and no one knows about the vessel. So we're left to deal with those. So among other reasons to remove these vessels, I really want to highlight the fact that these vessels are poisoning the environment. And it's not just the environment. It's the food sources for not a lot of aquatic animals as well as humans. Because they did a study in 2015, NOAA did, and they found that orcas were being poisoned by contaminants that could be directly related to derelict and abandoned vessels. And the way they were getting poisoned was they were eating salmon that had these concentrations of poisons in them. And as they eat more and more salmon, it gets concentrated further in the whales. So orcas are not the only ones that eat salmon. So there's a lot of other organisms out there that could be poisoned by these derelict and abandoned vessels. So it's really important that we get these vessels out of the environment as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, it's not always in our ability to do so. And I'll get to that in a little bit here too. But I just wanted to point this out, that they actually found a connection between these vessels and some harm to aquatic life. And I alluded to this earlier, who has the removal authority for these vessels. So the primary responsibility is the owners. So we always try and contact the owners first and ask them to remove their vessels and be responsible vessel owners. Typically that doesn't happen. So then whoever has jurisdiction and is an authorized public entity can go ahead and use the program and remove the vessel. If the authorized public entity is not the Department of Natural Resources, we can guide them through the process. And once they complete the process, they can request a reimbursement for their costs for the removal from our program. And we can reimburse them up to 90% of all of their costs, including in-kind costs and their administrative costs. So it really reduces the burden to these authorized public entities.
Hey, Troy.
Yeah.
That slide with the orcas. So
Yes.
how did they know that those chemicals were coming from derelict vessels? Because, you know, in a lot of places, there's so much pollution from stormwater, from creosote timbers, from, you know, toxic cleanup sites, you know, all kinds of things. And a lot of toxic cleanup sites have persistent organic pollutants. So I'm just really curious how, you know, I understand there's oil and lubricant and, stuff in the paint.
I understand your question, and I didn't mean to say that this was the only source of those pollutants.
Right.
The vessels are not the only source. They're a strong possible source because they have these pollutants on the vessels or in their cargo.
Okay.
So it's contributing to the overall problem, right?
Okay.
And that's all I meant. I didn't mean to say that derelict vessels are the only concern out there in the environment. No, definitely not. So this is a big wall of text. I don't need you to read it all, but I just wanted to point out a couple of things. In order for it to be entered into the program and into our database, it has to meet one of two definitions: abandoned vessel or derelict vessel. And for a vessel to be abandoned, it has to be out there for 30 days or more. For it to be derelict, we have to know who the owner is. So if we can't find ownership information, it can never be derelict. And then it has to be moored in a way that's in violation of posted established rules, or it's in the process of sinking, breaking up, or adrift. So even if the vessel's sinking and breaking up on shore and we don't know who the owner is, it's not considered derelict. And so that's an unfortunate thing, but I just wanted to point that out, that we are incapable of doing anything in this program unless it meets one of the two definitions. So our normal custody process, which means if we identify a vessel that's out there, it's been abandoned or derelict for a while, we get it to meet the definition. In order for us to remove that vessel, we have to go through due process. We have to get legal custody of the vessel and the authority to remove the vessel. In order for us to do that, we have to go through the custody process. It's 30 days to gain the legal right to remove the vessel, with another 30 days on top of that to allow the owner to appeal the custody process through the Pollution Control Hearing Board, which is an administrative judge and administrative court that's housed in State Parks headquarters in Tumwater. So, and that's the steps that we have to follow. We have to post the vessel, we have to put it on our website, we have to send out letters to the owners and any lien holders of record, we have to put it in the newspaper, and then at the 30-day mark, we would gain custody of the vessel. So it's a long, drawn-out process, even if it's an emergency, because there isn't a provision in there for us to take emergency temporary possession. We have to make the vessel safe and then go through the custody process before we can do anything else with the vessel. So there's always a time component when removing these vessels. So how do we prioritize these vessels for removal, right? Because we have limited funding, we have limited resources. There's 3 of us for the whole state. So we don't have the capacity to do a whole lot of vessels at the same time. So how do we prioritize these? Well, we have to prioritize them based on their threat to human safety and the environment. And that's what we use here. This is our scheme that we use. So ones are those emergencies that have a direct risk to hazardous conditions for human safety or the environment. And then it goes all the way down to 6, which is just boats that are abandoned on land, which are very low risk. So we have scenarios that meet these different criterias, and once we figure out where that vessel falls within the removal priority, we assign that priority to that vessel, and then we assign our limited resources accordingly. So we remove priority 1s first, then 2s, then 3s, then 4s. Once we assign a priority removal, it's not permanent, which means if the vessel changes its conditions or situations, we can change its removal priority. All we need to do is find out about it. So continuous reports from people in the area would be very helpful to keep us informed on its current condition and situation. So just to make sure that not a permanent situation. And once we run out of funds, we run out of the ability to remove vessels, unfortunately. So one of the things that we've been trying to do is prevent these vessels from becoming abandoned and derelict. And one of the things that they tried in the past is requiring insurance of all the vessels that are paying for moorage in ports or private marinas. So if they have a moorage agreement, they're supposed to have insurance on the vessel. And the moored facility is supposed to have insurance as well. And if either one of them don't have that, and the marina is not requiring them to have it, then they lose access to the derelict vessel removal account. That would be the teeth in that situation. So if a marina had someone that they weren't requiring them to have insurance, and the vessel becomes abandoned or derelict, and the marina removes it and they want to turn it into the vessel turn-in program, they can't do that. Or if a port has a same situation and they want reimbursement for the removal, they can't do that either because they weren't requiring insurance of their tenants. So that's something that we've been trying to educate all the ports and marinas out there about, to ensure that they maintain access to the derelict vessel removal account. One of the unintended consequences of this law, it pushed a lot of people who couldn't get insurances out of the marinas, away from the power supplies, and out on anchor. So now they're out on state-owned aquatic lands without anyone monitoring them, and they still don't have insurance. So that was one of the unintended consequences of that. But we are slowly dealing with that surge that happened. So some misconceptions about the program, I just want to cover those real quick. So we manage state-owned aquatic lands, and that's where our jurisdiction is. We don't have jurisdiction over private property, over other people's property like parks or fish and wildlife or anything else like that. So we can assist other jurisdictions with the removals. They can request us to come in and remove vessels. And if it's a priority to state-owned aquatic lands, then yes, we'll come into your jurisdiction and remove vessels. But it has to be a priority, and we have to have the funding, and then it has to be a threat to state-owned aquatic lands. So everyone in the state has to have registration. Every vessel in this state has to have state registration. And what I mean by that is there's a misconception out there that documented vessels don't have to register with the Department of Licensing or the Department of Revenue, and that's false. They get titled through the U.S. Coast Guard Documentation Center, but they still have to register with one of the state agencies. So that's something that I've been trying to get out there quite a bit. So this program is not compulsory, mainly because we don't have a blank check. We don't have the funding to remove every single vessel out there, and we don't have the jurisdiction everywhere, but we don't have the capacity either. There's 3 people in the program for the whole state, and there's only a limited number of contractors out there that can meet our requirements for the removal. So unfortunately, it's compulsory. It's not compulsory. It's a voluntary program. Now, I talked about funding a little bit, and I just wanted to touch base on this a little, because I was talking before the presentation about removing a ferry from Anacortes, which cost us a little over $1 million. Where did that funding come from? Well, it came from a one-time funding source from the legislature to remove large vessels. And they considered anything over 75 feet to be large vessels, because that's close to the point where the Coast Guard calls them ships and not boats. So that's where we got the money for that. And the DVRA, which is the derelict vessel removal account, is where we got the $2 million for this biennium. And then ALEA, which is the aquatic land enhancement account, which DNR has from its leases and the sale of gooey ducks. And that's where we got the $500,000 from as well. So out of all of that funding, so out of the $5 million that we got this biennium, we have about $100,000 left until the end of the biennium, which is June 30th. So we're out of funds, unfortunately, for this biennium. So where does the money go? Well, it goes through the removal of these vessels. And this is a breakdown of how much it costs to remove a vessel based on its intended use. So as constructed, if a vessel is constructed for a commercial source, then on average, it costs us about $55,000 to remove and deal with that vessel. A recreational vessel is a lot cheaper at almost $6,000. Military and government vessels are very expensive. They're over $400,000. And the reason why is the way they're built. Government and military vessels are very stout and sturdy, and deconstructing them is very labor intensive, and that's why it costs a lot more money. Recreational vessels are typically fiberglass. You crunch them up and you throw them away. So they're not as labor intensive. Now I want to point out to you the VTIP average cost, which is the vessel turn-in program. That's for vessel owners who are not able to deal with their vessel anymore and they can't afford to get rid of them. So they can turn them into the state for free disposal. And that's really important because we don't want them to go out there and just cut these vessels loose. They can turn them into the state for free. And if you look at that average cost, it's only about $3,500. And that's a huge savings just over the recreational ones. We can pull out a lot more vessels through the vessel turn-in program. And that becomes really important here in a second when I talk about the cap that the legislature initially put on the vessel turn-in program. We were only allowed to spend up to $200,000 per biennium on the vessel turn-in program. So we weren't able to remove a whole lot, and we ran out of funds within the first 12 months. This last legislative session in 2020, we had that cap removed, so we can spend up to our appropriated balance from the legislature of the $2 million in the vessel turn-in program if we wanted to. Now that's not realistic, but what would be realistic is for us to spend $400,000, $500,000 in a biennium for getting these voluntary vessels off the water and out of the environment. And that was our intention.
Question, what about the government? If we're talking about a Navy or a Marine boat, do they not compensate us for getting rid of it?
That is something that we're actually talking over with NOAA and the federal government about. To answer your question directly, no, they don't pitch in at all. They don't have any funds for it, and they just refuse to take responsibility for it, because what they do is they typically sell these vessels through the GSA to private individuals. For an example, I don't know if any of you are aware of the Hero down on the Palix River, which was a science vessel that was run down in Antarctica. It was the last wooden icebreaker. That vessel was sold through GSA to a nonprofit group in Oregon who ran it as a tour. And when they ran out of funds, they sold it to a private individual who ran tours around Coos Bay. And when he ran out of funds, he sold it to the guy who lives across the street from the vessel currently in Bay Center. He doesn't have a job. He doesn't have any resources to deal with the vessel, and he was stripping the vessel for any value when it sank, unfortunately. So what I'm saying is there's multiple owners after the federal government has gotten rid of these vessels, and there's just really no way for us to say, hey, federal government, this was your boat, you need to take care of it. And they're just going to say, well, we sold it. We're trying to change that so they have to deal with these vessels properly whenever they want to decommission one, because they're just too expensive otherwise to get rid of.
So a lot of people are buying boats that they have no assets other than the boat, and they aren't required to insure them.
Correct.
Course,
so
yeah,
we did change a law recently. Unfortunately, it wasn't in time for the Hero, but we have a secondary liability law now, which means if your vessel is over 35 feet and older than 40 years old and you sell it to someone, you have to have a seaworthiness inspection on it. You have to document that inspection, and you have to send a form to my office along with that inspection within 30 days of the sale. And if you do all of that, then you shed your secondary liability as a seller. If you don't do any of it, or you forget a step of it, then you retain secondary liability. And what does that mean? That means if that vessel becomes abandoned or derelict caused by the person you sold it to, and they're unable to deal with it, we can go after you for restitution. So hopefully that'll prevent people from selling these old fishing boats that are no longer seaworthy and they're just too costly to repair to people in a bar for $10 on a napkin. to someone who has no idea what they're getting into, but they have great dreams and aspirations for owning a yacht and living on the sea. My whole job is dream collecting. And really, I collect all of these dreams and I remove them out of the water. It's terrible, but there's a lot of people out there that just don't understand that boat means bust out another 1,000. So I hope that answers your question, Jim.
Thank you. It seems to me the whole thing is a result of systematic failures. And the one thing the government can fix is the system.
I would agree that there's a lot of things that we could do. The problem is getting people to support the change within the legislature, because there's a lot of stakeholders that we have to convince that this is a good idea. And one of them is the Recreational Boating Alliance, or the Northwest Marine Trade Association, or the Brokers Associations, or the Commission for Ports. So there's a lot of pushback in some areas because we're trying to reach into their, apparently we're trying to reach into their pocket and affect their profits. So we really need some help out there. And that's why I do these talks, is to get the information out there so that people are informed.
Yeah.
So we have done some improvements recently on the program. One of them, what I talked about earlier, was the vessel turning program. We removed the cap so we can remove more vessels inexpensively, without hitting that $200,000 cap in the first 12 months. So now we can spend, $400,000 or $500,000 on the removal of these vessels, which saves us a whole lot of effort and time trying to get them out of the water. So then we reduced the liability, the secondary liability law, from 65 feet to 35 feet. The reason why is 35 feet is usually the tipping point where people stop pulling them out of the water, because once you get over 35 feet, it's really hard to trailer them across the road. So they're a higher threat. They're because they're always in the water. And that's why we reduced it to 35 feet. So we did get the law passed to allow us to issue grants to local law enforcement offices to encourage them to go out to their aquatic environments and enforce aquatic laws, registration of vessels, anchoring, improper mooring or towing or whatever. Just get out there and talk to these people and encourage the law enforcement officers to enforce vessel registration laws, which is not being done right now. Unfortunately, those funds were cut from our budget last year because of the COVID epidemic, but we're trying to get them into this year's budget talks. So hopefully this legislative session, we'll get those funds back and we'll be able to do this. And that's just part of our prevention efforts, because we really don't want to have to deal with these vessels. We want to prevent them from happening in the first place. So then they gave us ticketing authority so that we can write tickets for vessel registration, because that's not a criminal offense. So we can just send a ticket in the mail for vessel owners who failed to register the vessels. And we typically wait until that's like the last resort to encourage vessels owners to be responsible for their vessels. It's not something that we jump to right at first. It's just another tool in our toolbox to help encourage responsible vessel ownership. So we recently changed the program again to include on our website a reporting tool, DART. So you can go onto our website on your computer, your cell phone, or whatever, and pull up a map, click on it, and enters a little bit of information, attach a photo if you want, and it sends a report directly to our program so that we're aware of it. It's really easy, fast. If you know about MyCoast, we also have an account on MyCoast that you can use to send these reports, and we get emailed about those. So it's really easy to send out these reports because we only work Monday through Friday business hours. But if you're out there on the water on the weekend and you find an abandoned derelict boat, send us a report. Just pull out your phone, click on the vessel on our website and send it to us. And then we can evaluate it and maybe put it on our list and maybe get it removed in the future. The point is, if we don't know about it, we can't do anything about it. So let us know about those. So one of the things that we had passed into law last year, but the funding was stripped, was we wanted to start a recycling program, because this is the Department of Natural Resources, not just the aquatic environment, but a land as well, so uplands. So we're taking our trash out of the water and we're throwing them in landfills. It doesn't make sense. What we need to do is come up with a sustainable way of dealing with these vessels after we get them out of the water. And we found one way to do it was to recycle fiberglass and wooden vessels in a manner that allows concrete and paper mills to burn the material in their power plants to generate energy in their manufacturing process. Rhode Island did a study and they burned some fiberglass vessels and it worked out great for them. And they burn it at such a high temperature that there's virtually no emissions. So, or no change in their emissions, I should say. So what we're trying to do is start something like that in this state. And as soon as we get the funding, we'll be able to push a lot further into that. I have a lot of the pieces in place already. All we're waiting for is some way to process these vessels into 1-inch chips. So we have to take that full-size vessel and chip it down to about 1 inches. And a lot of people just don't want to use their chippers on these vessels because of the metal that's in them. It might cause damage to their chippers. So,
Hey, Troy?
Yeah.
Some of us have a little bit, I mean, I don't personally think that burning is recycling.
okay.
But, and I was gonna ask you that like, what happens to most of these vessels once they're pulled out? Do most of them just go to a landfill? Like, you know, I don't know if the rest of you agree with me, but it seems like recycling is a little different than burning. And I'm sorry, I can't explain that right now.
I understand exactly what you're saying. We're not reusing the product, right?
Right, right.
Just reusing it in a different way now. So I understand what you're saying, and I don't have the numbers, but I'm being reassured by the Rhode Island crew that did it, which was actually a college, did the program in Rhode Island. They looked at the data, they looked at their emissions, and it fell within their emission standards for their power plant. I can only assume that it didn't change enough for them to be worried about their emissions when they burn these vessels. However, I understand what you're saying. There is a company out there that chips vessels or can chip vessels and put it into plaster or a fiberglass resin that's a no VOC resin, and they use jersey barriers, manhole covers and telephone poles and stuff like that. That would be more recycling that I think you're talking about. And I'm open to that. The problem is they wanted me to take these boats and haul them over the Cascades to a city near Yakima.
Yeah.
It just wasn't really cost effective for me to get all of these boats over the mountains so that they could put them in their products, unfortunately. And when I asked them to bring their chipper to this side, they said they couldn't do it. So all I want to do is chip these boats up, and maybe we send them to a concrete manufacturing plant, or maybe we send them to this company. First step, got to get them chipped. So, and the reason why we want to do this is we can't take these fiberglass and wooden vessels and put them in normal landfills because there's lead contaminants, there's heavy metal contaminants. No one wants these in their construction waste areas so that they can recycle them because of the hazardous materials that are associated with these vessels. There's a lot of materials on these vessels that prevent life from growing, and that same material is toxic to other things. So it's a hard nut to crack, but it's a problem that we're working on. And I just want to make sure that you're all aware that we're aware that putting them in the landfill is not sustainable, and that we're working towards something different. If you have suggestions, please send them to us. I'm more than willing to have the conversation. So that ends my presentation. However, I'm sure there's a few questions that may have come up, and I would be happy to answer those questions.
Did you have a question, Lee? unmute.
Yeah, I've got 4 questions here. So you
Great.
mentioned that there's 301 vessels on your list now. Is there an area where most of these are? Like,
Yeah, so let me show you my database.
Yeah.
So this is my database, and this is just the Grays Harbor area, and I'm sure you're aware of that, but
Yeah.
you see all the vessels that are there? So
Yeah.
only the green ones are currently there. All the other ones have been removed or processed in some other way. So if we pull out from the map a little bit, you can see where concentrations lie. And it's primarily in the Puget Sound. So let me go all the way out to the very, and I will show you all of the vessels. So west side really has a problem. The east side really doesn't have a problem. So taking that, the majority of them are going to be where your resources are located. So near towns and cities and stuff that have resources like Poulsbo or Bremerton or Port Orchard or Seattle. Down on the Columbia River, it's going to be the Astoria area or Vancouver or Portland area.
yeah.
In the past, Grays Harbor has had an issue with a lot of their fishing fleet aging out and having nowhere to go because they couldn't get insurance on these vessels. So they really couldn't pull them out, get them hauled out, and they couldn't moor them in Westport. So
Right.
I hope that answers your questions about where they're concentrated. It's primarily in the Puget Sound.
Okay. Have you pulled any out from the Port of Willapa? There's a couple on their dock that look like, they've been there forever.
So the port is able to use our program, and I would be happy to help them work through the program.
Right.
Because they are an authorized public entity as a port district.
Right.
They have jurisdiction in their area and they can use this program to deal with those vessels. And I would be happy to talk to anyone from the Port of Willapa.
Okay. And is this tool available to the public?
This
mapping?
is not available at this time. However, we do have a map that's like this. When you go to the DART, you can
yeah.
look at all the vessels that are out there. And the reason why we do that is we really don't want to advertise where these vessels are, because then people will go out there and strip them of their value and accidentally sink them in the process. All you have to do is take one brass fitting off in the wrong location and you just created a hole in your hull, and that sinks the vessel, which makes it a lot more difficult to remove. So, but I would be happy to share any information that you were looking for from the map.
And one last question, what's the average length of time that it takes to remove one of these vessels?
So for your priority ones, when we have money and the capability, it can take as little as 60 days for us to remove them and deal with them. Others, they have stayed on our list for years because they haven't met the priority level yet for assigning resources to them. So it's really hard to say an average, but the most of the vessels that we deal with have only been out there for a year or less. I hope that answers it.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. I can run that report for you right now and show you what I was talking about, the 301 vessels. This is also available on our website, by the way, this report. I run it every quarter and I publish it on our website, along with the vessels that we remove. So you can see up here in this corner that there's a 301 vessels on here. And this is organized by priority. So the ones that are at the top of the list here are our highest priorities. And then as we move down, we get priority 2s, and 3s and 4s until we get to the priority 5s. So there's only 19 pages here. That kind of tells you how many vessels we have out there. And they run the gamut of sizes and construction types and everything else. So there's quite a bit of them out there. Unfortunately, we just don't have the funding to remove them all. ARBA, I talked about ARBA before, the Recreational Boating Alliance here in Washington. They're trying to get the legislature to allocate some of the water excise taxes that we all pay to my program. So they're looking just to get, a few percentages of the taxes that are already collected diverted from the general fund to our program, which would generate about $3 million every biennium for our program, in addition to what we're already getting. So we would get about 5 million every biennium, which would be a huge increase on what we can do.
Yeah, that would be nearly double, wouldn't it be?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It would nearly be double, plus it's not a new tax on anyone because it's already being removed.
Does anybody else have any questions? I'm not seeing any in the chat, but feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions that you have.
Yeah, this is Jim. I've worked in Congress and the office of the president and a number of other political positions in my life. I'm retired now, but my observation is that if you've got a big problem, you have to put together a big solution and acquire a big bunch of backers for it. And trying to change the laws one little ordinance at a time is not worth the effort, because the people who are going to push back just as hard. And if you have something big, you can say, look, this is a problem that we've got a lot of people behind fixing, and you can get it through. I have a friend who got a law passed. It took him 3 years to do it, but they can get passed against a pushback if it's got enough supporters behind it, and if it's big enough to actually solve the problem. Is there anyone working on that angle of putting a big solution together and a big coalition together behind it to get it over the hill?
So that question's complicated, and I want to say yes, but in reality, no. And the reason why I say that is I work for the Department of Natural Resources, who has a political leader. So if she doesn't agree with what's being pushed and she doesn't want to invest her political capital in that, then she doesn't put her weight behind that. And I don't know if you've seen in the news recently, but she just had a huge push for fire funding to help with reducing fire risks in the state, and also paying for firefighters and stuff like that. So she has priorities that may differ from mine. And so that's my first and ultimate battle, is that one, is getting it to her level and getting her approval and getting her on board. And if she's trying to push something else through, then typically I get the raw end of that deal. However, I do work with stakeholders a lot. I talk to a lot of ports and marinas. I talk to the Recreational Boating Alliance, the NMTA, the ports commissions. I talk to them and I educate them, and they're the ones that initiated this last push for the additional funding from the excise tax. And hopefully that gets through. But we're supporting them in any way we can without actually putting our names on it, because I work for a political person. And she has obviously political capital that she can spend or not. So it's unfortunate. I think that's the nicest way I can say that about my boss.
No, I understand that. And, I've dealt with lots of people in that position, and sometimes it takes an outside force, and this isn't something that is going to accumulate an outside force very easily, because there's no way to make money off of changing this. And if there's nobody who's going to make any money off of a change, that change is hard to make.
There's one industry that'll make money, well, two industries that'll make money off of the removal of vessels: the salvage company and the hazardous waste remediation companies. They both make money off of me like no one's business. So most of my money goes towards them in the removal of these vessels. So, and that's where I'm talking about capacity, because there's very few companies out there that have the capability of doing what these few companies do. And because of that, they can't remove 20 vessels all at the same time, but they can remove onesies, twosies all year long. But if we get more contractors out there that have the capability, then we would be able to utilize them if we had the funds.
Okay. Well, it's the thing in politics is follow the money.
Yes.
And if you want X to happen, you figure out who makes a profit if X happens, and you get them to fund the change.
That's why I'm talking to you, Jim, and to others.
Okay.
Linda said the chipper sounds like a good opportunity. Well, Linda and Artie said the chipper sounds like a good opportunity for a business. Maybe the local wood chippers would be convinced to make this a business. That'd be nice, because we have a lot of wood chippers in our area. So
you do. In fact, we've sent a few boats to that one landfill there that recycles wood for bark and stuff like that down there in Grays Harbor. So yeah, we're always looking for different ways of dealing with these vessels. And I encourage everyone to send their thoughts to me so that we can discuss them and possibly use them.
Well, I have to say, from the last speaker and who profits from this, it sounds to me the insurance companies profit from this. They're the ones that insure the boats. They do so for a period of time, and in the insurance time, they've probably made up the cost of the entire boat 2 times over, if not more. And then they're the ones that are not insuring these boats, deeming them not seaworthy because they're 40 years old or older, and that's causing this problem.
Yes, access to cheap insurance is definitely a hurdle that we have to deal with. I agree with you that it's really hard to get an insurance company to pay out, especially when dealing with the vessel. We have to prove to them that the owner has liability, because there's really no one out there providing hull removal insurance that's not exorbitant in costs. So they get liability only, or they get pollution liability. And then we have to write them a ticket to make them criminally liable for the vessel in order to get the insurance company to remove them. And that's only if they didn't stop paying the insurance company the day before the vessel sank. So
again, it sounds like it is the insurance company's fault, and they're the ones that are creating this issue and problem.
If they're even involved in those vessels, a lot of the vessels have never been insured at all because they've been kicked out of the marinas and ports that are trying to follow the law. So now these vessels are just out on anchor or on a buoy somewhere, just deteriorating until they become another issue. So a lot of the times they don't have insurance. So I zoomed into the map just to show you really quickly. The green is state-owned aquatic lands, and everything else is other. So it's really important when you click on the map to locate that vessel to try and get it as close as possible to the actual location, so that we can work with whoever's jurisdiction it might lie in. We're not saying that we're not going to deal with it. We just might not have the legal authority to do what we want immediately without talking to someone else first. So it's just one of the little quirks of the program is that we only have jurisdiction on state-owned aquatic lands.
And would that include the rivers? And I mean, when you say state-owned aquatic lands, who owns the river?
The state does.
Okay.
They're historical paths, I should say, because a lot of them are meandering, and sometimes they meander right out of the jurisdiction. There's actually aquatic land in South Seattle that is being leased, which is no longer aquatic lands because of that reason. Because back when we took statehood, it was actually aquatic lands, and then it changed after that. So, but historically, we do have the lakes and the rivers and as well as the aquatic land in the saltwater.
That's really interesting though. Like, you know, the Chehalis and the Satsup move around a lot. So
They do.
So the state land doesn't follow the new channel at all. How would that be updated?
So in order to update it, they would have to go through a legal process where they would have to have a survey done and then change ownership of those, and you'd have to get the permission of the current landowner where the river channel has moved. So it's not something that they do typically on a day-to-day basis, and it's unfortunate, but there's a lot of gaps in some areas. I can show you on one of the rivers in let's see. So you can see in this location where state-owned aquatic lands is not necessarily in the aquatic environment anymore.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunate, because if it was to land on the point of that bend, it would be out of our jurisdiction.
Yeah, that is crazy.
Yeah.
And getting individual landowners to offer that up would be probably very challenging.
Well, you'd be surprised how many landowners would say, "You want to remove that boat off my property? Heck yeah, come and get it."
Oh yeah. But to change the area that where the state land is might be challenging.
Oh yeah, it's very challenging.
Yeah, they probably would be happy if you came and removed a boat off their property.
They would, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, does anybody else have any more questions?
I just want to thank Tony for teaching us about the life cycle of a boat from birth to death. I've worked with Chris Craft and Bertram Yacht and a few other boat companies, and they never think about what is the guy who buys the boat for $10 20 years from now.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm just the collector of dreams. So I go out there and collect dreams all day long. Unfortunately, I'm usually the last ones to touch these vessels, unfortunately. But without the program, there wouldn't be a whole lot of options for anyone else out there. And believe it or not, Washington is way ahead of any other state or other country for that matter in this matter. Canada has modeled their program after us and in their attempts to make a program recently, as well as California is doing the same thing. Oregon is trying to bring up their standards to ours as well. So we started a movement, and hopefully the more people we get involved in this, the better the solutions that we can come up with, because everyone's thinking about the solutions. So.
Yeah, that's a great program. Thank you so much for joining us this evening and giving a wonderful talk, Troy. It was so great to have you. So I really appreciate your time. And I know I learned a lot. So I think everybody else did too. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. I really appreciate it, the opportunity.
Good job.
Thank you.
Great
Thank you.
presentation.
Best of luck.
Have a nice evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.